Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is the podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah. Happy Tuesday. I hope you had a wonderful Memorial Day weekend, whether that was remembering loved ones or just enjoying having the long weekend, really whatever it involved for you. I had a bit of a weepy weekend, but in a good way. My brother's youngest daughter, he has 3. She's smack in the middle of my nieces. I have 5, and she's 3. She's number 3. Graduated from high school on Sunday, so yeah, bittersweet. I'm so stinking proud of all my nieces, and this was no exception. We grew up in a very small town. She graduated from the same high school I did, and my class was bigger than her class. Her class had 32. My class had 40. Her older sister's class had, I think, 25 3 years ago. So you can tell that it's a bit of a smaller town. I know I've talked about it before, but first time they've ever had graduation outside. We've always had it in the gym. Hotter than snot in the gym. But they had it outside, and it was apparently hotter than snot outside. As hot as Montana gets this time of year. But first time they've ever had it outside because of COVID. Last year they had it, everybody had to sit in their cars. They had it in the parking lot. This year they had it on the football field. And so just new stuff all around. But very proud of her, and was definitely having some happy tears about her graduation. And my babies are all growing up. At any rate, let's talk about books. Let's talk about a specific book in particular. Today I am speaking with author Alison Levy, as I mentioned at the end of the last 2 episodes, being confused at the one before this last one. I am speaking with Alison Levy about her Damon collecting series. We're talking about the first book in that series. It is called Gatekeeper. Here is the description of that book. Rachel Wilde comes from a dimension that exists adjacent to ours. The people there have structured their society around daemon collecting. They locate, catch, and repair malfunctioning daemons, creatures out of phase with our world that tempt people to do good or evil. Now Rachel has been given 2 unusual assignments. 1, find a person who has been trying to break down dimensional barriers, and 2, track down a line of missing gatekeepers, human placeholders for a daemon that was too badly damaged to repair. Authorities of Rachel's world believe the missing gatekeepers are descended from a girl who went missing from West Africa hundreds of years ago, likely sold into slavery. With no leads to go on, Rachel seeks help from Bach, a raving homeless man who happens to be an oracle. Bach does put her in the path of both of her targets, but he also lands her in a life-threatening situation. Rachel must stop the criminal, reunite a gatekeeper with her stolen past, and above all, survive. Again, that's the description of Gatekeeper. The author is Alison Levy. It is the first book in her Damon collecting series, and I really enjoyed this story. A couple of things. I love the cover. The cover does represent this sort of little bubble between dimensions where Rachel lives. There's a house, and it kind of looks like it's in a snow globe. The house is in terrible repair in the book, but it looks so cute on the cover. It's this little purple Victorian, and I want to live there. That has absolutely nothing to do with anything except that I want to live there. Also, daemons are not what we think of when we think of demons, scary. They tempt people to do either good or bad, so they're not necessarily good or bad in and of themselves. They just carry out a function. So if you are tempted to steal that candy bar, just stick it in your pocket and walk away with it, that could be a daemon whispering in your ear, that sort of thing. Or maybe you suddenly find yourself wanting to pay for the groceries of the person in line in front or behind you. Could be a different kind of daemon whispering in your ear. There's a daemon that ends up with Rachel throughout the book. She's supposed to just turn them in and they get fixed and then either, sent back out to do their job, or if they can't be fixed, then there's that whole placeholder situation that's mentioned on the back. But there's this daemon who is gone a little wonky, and Rachel collects him and takes him back to the office, and then he shows up at her house. They drop him off and says that she has to watch him. And this daemon, I say he, it's not a he, it's an it, I guess, a they. Let's go with they. That seems kinder. So this demon wears, when Rachel finds the daemon, they're wearing this whole pile of clothes, and she gets that down to just one item of clothing, a woman's coat. And Rachel can see daemons. Most people can't unless they're wearing special glasses. But Rachel can see them, and when Alison, as the author, describes this daemon, it doesn't sound particularly cute. I mean, it sounds pretty, and yet it wears this woman's coat, and it's this tiny little thing in this giant woman's coat. And so most people can't see the daemon, and they just see this coat moving about on its own. And for some reason, I don't know. That might have been my favorite character in the book, was this little random wonky daemon in a woman's coat crawling around. I don't know what that says about me, but I really liked the little daemon, and I think that I shall name them, because maybe it's my spirit animal. I don't know. I'm going to go contemplate my own need for psychotherapy. Let's turn to the interview so that Alison can tell you more about the book, and I can stop babbling about adorable little not adorable daemons in women's coats. All right. Again, the book is called Gatekeeper. The author is Alison Levy.
Hi, Alison. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I am happy to have you here. We are going to talk about your new book, Gatekeeper. Before we get to the book, though, I would love if you could share a little bit about yourself so my listeners can get to know you.
Sure. Well, I grew up a whole bunch of places when I was young, mostly in Virginia, though. Ended up moving to Pennsylvania for school, where I met my husband. We lived in Pennsylvania for several years after that and had our son. We moved down to North Carolina, where we are now. And I had been to law school. I briefly practiced law, but I was very good at law school. I was not a very good lawyer. So I was happy to give that up, and kind of became a full-time mom, but decided at the same time to really dive into my writing, which I've been doing since I was about 12. So with my husband's support, I kind of took that up more full-time and looked into publishing, and this is my first real dive into the world of authorship.
I love it. I talk to a lot of authors who have been lawyers, who are lawyers. There seems to be a connection there. I don't exactly know what it is, but there definitely seems to be a connection between being a lawyer or going to law school and being an author.
Actually, yeah. I get it, because to be a good lawyer, you have to be able to write very clearly, very concisely, and to really get your point across. So I can see where the connection is. But there's another side of lawyering that involves interacting with people and being very, very go-getter, and I can see where a lot of authors that would not appeal to you. It did not appeal to me.
Right. Yeah, definitely a different set of social skills to be between being a lawyer and being an author, I would imagine. So the book is called, like I said, Gatekeeper. It is book one in the Is it Daemon, or how do you pronounce Daemon? Daemon. Okay, I thought so, but
Daemon, yes.
All right, that's how I say it in my head, but then I wasn't sure. So book one in the Daemon collecting series. Can you give a bit of an overview of this book and kind of the series as a whole?
Sure. This book focuses on my character, Rachel Wilde. Her name, she would tell you, is pronounced Raquel. but even in my head, I call her Rachel because that's what it looks like on paper. But she is from another dimension, one that interacts frequently with ours, to come and collect malfunctioning daemons. And daemons are small little creatures, or can be very large creatures, that they sort of exist out of phase with our reality, and they tempt people for good or for evil, that they're influencing human behavior, but that they break down. They're not sentient creatures. These are cogs in a cosmic machine that break occasionally, and her people repair them. So she's essentially a glorified dog catcher, my character. She catches them, she brings them in. And in the course of her doing her job, she's given two unusual assignments. One, to find someone who's a gatekeeper, hence the title of the book, that this is someone who's become her family has become a placeholder for a daemon that was too badly damaged to repair and has to be held somewhere else. And the family then stands in for the daemon in our reality, so that the daemon can't get out of its prison existence. And the other assignment she's given is to find someone who's been breaking dimensional barriers, trying to cause a rift. And in the course of doing these two jobs, she accidentally uncovers a larger conspiracy, which will take up the bulk of the series that I'm writing. And that this conspiracy comes from her world, that it then comes into our reality and is affecting a much larger spread of issues. So in the first book, it's just hit on the surface, but I want to dive into it as the books go on.
Mm-hmm. And I'm so glad you said that you think of her in your head as Rachel, because she very clearly says at the beginning of the book it's pronounced Raquel, and I promptly forgot that as I was reading through the book.
And, which is totally understandable, but it's one of the things I like to look at in my writing, is looking at how different cultures see things. So we look at Rachel, if we had an English-speaking culture, and we see Rachel. Her culture, she says to another character, they don't have a ch sound. There's no such sound in their language, so it would automatically be a k sound. But right. I like little cultural differences like that, just to make it interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
It's time to take our first break of the podcast, but isn't it interesting how our brains work? I mean, I see that word, Rachel, and I pronounce it Rachel. I said Rachel when I was reading the description on the back of the book, even though clearly, as I said, when Alison's writing and Rachel is talking to Bach, she says there's no ch sound in their language, and so her name is actually pronounced Raquel. I was like, oh, yes, okay, so I need to put that into my brain. Nope. Read it as Rachel every single time after that. Maybe I'll try to do that for the next book. Raquel. At any rate, we're going to take that first break. When we come back, Alison will be talking about her inspiration for this series. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Do you want to be healthier, yet you just don't know what to do? All these shows telling you this and that, but nothing seems to work. Well, listen close. Golden State Media Concepts has got something great for you. The Health and Wellness Podcast, dedicated to workout trends, healthy eating habits, diet, and everything about healthy living. Join us in our banters as we help you not just live life to the fullest, but live it to the healthiest.
GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with Alison Levy about the first book in her Daemon collecting series. It is called Gatekeeper. Let's go ahead and return to that interview.
This is the first book. What was your inspiration for the series?
I've always had kind of a fascination with things that we see every day but don't really think about. Like one of the things I wrote about in this book was a random door out back of a restaurant. It's not connected to anything. It's just like an old door somebody took off and it's leaning against a wall. And it's the sort of thing you see once and you think, oh, that's weird. And then you might see it again every day, but then you just don't think about it. But to my main character, this is actually a portal that she uses to get to and from the office. So I like the idea of little things that we overlook being important in some other context. And I think when my inspiration from it came from Neil Gaiman's book Neverwhere, if you've ever heard of it, about sort of a similar thing of a underworld, not in a mythical sense, but a underworld being a collection of people and things that sort of fall through the cracks and that we might see every day but don't quite register with us. And I like that idea, but on a sort of a grander scale.
Yeah, and we get that on a couple of levels in the book, because not only are there things like the door that appears to just be junk and goes nowhere, but we also have the daemons who we don't see, but they influence our lives or the lives of the people in the book. So there is the world that we would recognize as our own, and then there's also the arcana. Did I say that right?
Yeah.
That's Rachel's world. Yes. We don't learn a lot about Rachel's world in this one. Are we going to learn a little bit more about that and how it interacts with this world as the books go on?
Yes, absolutely. Starting in the next one, there will be more discussion of her world, and moving forward, because we'll see more and more of this conspiracy that's coming to light that comes from her world, and we'll learn more and more about the cultural interactions and the way that her culture differs or is similar to ours. But the daemons. I did try to clarify in my book that it's not demons, it is daemons. But demons is like it's a religious thing. It's a mythical thing in some cultures. It's creatures of evil that live apart from angelic creatures, that they're two separate things. Daemon is more of a classical, like a Greek classical type word, where it's more of like a not quite mortal, not quite divine. It's more of a nature spirit, which is closer to what I had in mind for this, that these are things that exist all around us, and they tempt for good and evil, but they're not in themselves good and evil. They are just things, and they just exist. And for us to see them would probably freak us out, as happens to one of my characters later in books when she sees one. But that they're not inherently scary in and of themselves. They are just really cogs in a machine, except for this one in my book that takes on a life of its own.
Yeah, yes, they're really morally neutral, except for the one that I don't want to ruin too much about things that happen in the book. Although I kind of hope that little, I'll just say little guy, whether that little guy keeps making an appearance, because I don't know, I kind of like him, whatever you want to call it.
The little daemon, yes.
Yes. Let's talk a little bit more about Rachel. What about her as the protagonist do you think will resonate with readers?
What I really like about her that makes her interesting to write is that she is much more open with her emotions in some ways than most of us feel comfortable being, or certainly more so than I feel comfortable being. That she's stuck in this place right now she doesn't really want to be. She's doing a job she doesn't particularly like, and she's not really shy about just being annoyed about it. I think many of us we're in the mindset that we have to be polite about things. We have to be smiley and good about interacting with some people, and she doesn't really feel the need to be that way. That she just feels okay being irritated. she, again, doing a job she doesn't really like, and she doesn't particularly care that people know she doesn't particularly like the job. So it's a much more freer way of interacting, I think, than many people, especially women, I think are accustomed to being, that we're not supposed to show that irritation. She acts very much the way that sometimes I wish I could act, that she doesn't have the anxiety that I have hampering her down. She doesn't deal with the depressive episodes that I sometimes get, that she is very steady, she's very confident in her abilities, and she speaks her mind without being super. I mean, she can come across as abrasive, but I wonder too, is it that she's abrasive, or is it just that we're not used to hearing someone, particularly a woman, talk very plainly about things? It's really, if I didn't have the emotional hiccups that I do, if I didn't have maybe the culturally enforced social issues that we do, I think I would talk much more like her. And I would certainly love to have her confidence in herself. She knows what she can do. She knows what she can't do. She doesn't mind asking for help, and she doesn't mind feeling that she doesn't need help.
Yeah, and you get a little glimpse of that at the very beginning of the book, because she oversleeps, something very simple. But she one knows she overslept, and she's like, crap. And then two, she gets to work, and she's like, yeah, well, that's how it is, and that's what happens. Can't go back and change it, really. So let's just move forward. There's no like massive apology. It's just, this is what happens. What do we do now? So,
absolutely. I love that the thing that set the whole book into place really was that she just overslept.
Yep.
It's just a minor that she overslept, and everything followed from there.
Yep. Yes, I understand that. I completely understand oversleeping. When you sit down to write, especially a main character, but also there are a number of obviously other characters in the book, how much character development do you like to do before you start writing the book, or does that kind of develop as you write?
Both, really. I need to have a sense of them in my head, a sense of their voice, before I can sit down to write, especially for dialogue. Because when I sit down to write, often the dialogue is the first thing I'll do, and I'll just run through the dialogue straight down the page, and then go back and fill in the details of it. And I need to have that character's voice in my head in order to make the dialogue sound convincing, even if it's just to me to sound convincing. But oftentimes, as I go back to fill it in, I'll start to get a better feel for the character in the details, and we'll develop from there. But yeah, so really it has to be both. I have to start with the feel of the character, but I have to let the character grow as I'm developing the story.
Jumping in here so we can take our second break of the podcast, but I actually really like what Alison just said about letting the character grow, so it's not just set in stone. Alison doesn't write down a character profile and then that just never changes, no matter what circumstances or how the book might change. I don't know. I'm fascinated the way everything comes together when it comes to writing. So we probably figured that out since I ask a lot of questions. Any rate, time for that second break. When we return, we will be talking about the arc of the series as a whole. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts Social Media Podcast. Time to hashtag everything. We talk about all the fun, crazy stories on social media. From Instagram to Facebook, Twitter to Tumblr, or probably even Friendster. Join us each week as we explore the quirky side of social media. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Social Media Podcast.
It's simple, such a sad song. The one that we rely on to get us.
welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. We have just obviously come back from a break, and now we're going to return to the interview with author Alison Levy about her book, Gatekeeper.
And in terms of the arc of the series, do you have an end point in mind in terms of numbers of books, or do you have an end point in mind and you'll see how many books it takes you to get there?
Definitely number 2. I know where it's all going to land. I know how it's all going to end up. I'm hoping it'll be 5 or 6 books, but again, sometimes it takes on a life of its own as you're writing, or sometimes as I'm writing, I'm realizing, okay, I need to flesh this part out a lot more to make it make sense. So it's just going to depend on how it goes as I write it.
Okay. Yeah, makes sense to me. I can only imagine that you could be in the middle of what you thought of was going to be your, last book or your penultimate book and be like, oh, wait, no, we can't get there yet.
Exactly.
Too much that still needs to be explained. Yeah. How about world building? In this book, we do have the world that would be recognizable as our own, and then there's Rachel's world that we're getting a glimpse of. But do you like to do a lot of world building beforehand, or again, does that kind of develop as you write?
World building is really my favorite part of writing. So I like to start with a good feel for how it's going to look. The details will often come out as I go, but I do love to start from a world building standpoint, and often we'll do that before I even have a good feel of the characters. One of the key things I started with here for Rachel's world, which I haven't got into much. I will get into more in the upcoming book, but that her world historically stemmed more from a matriarchal base than, whereas ours stemmed more patriarchal. So I wanted it to come up in little ways in the first book, like Rachel in points where she will, when she's referring to someone in the abstract, like we will often say, a person does this if he is such, where she will then use the feminine pronoun. She will use she, because the matriarchy is at the root of her culture instead. So I want there to be those little things that I can weave in as I go. So I have to start with a more firmer world building. I also think religion has not played as big a role in her world as it has in ours. So in the way that you'll see that in the first book is that she avoids swear words that have to do with religion. She almost, I don't think, as I wrote, I made it a point not to have her say damn, or not to have her curse with God or any religious-based word, because there's no root for it in her language. So I had to start with the world building in order to have those little things to pepper throughout.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm excited to meet more of Alison. Excuse me, your family. No, Rachel's family. What happens when I'm looking at the book cover and I'm reading while I'm talking? Yeah. I'm excited to meet more of Rachel's family, because you get, like I said, glimpses, and you can see some of that matriarchal society in just one little kind of almost throwaway comment that her mom makes in terms of reacting to something that is said about her son. And I mean, it's just like one sentence, but I'm like, that would be where Rachel gets her bluntness.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So how about research? Did you do any particular research for the book?
Bits and pieces here and there. This book, I started and stopped and rewrote several times before I kind of hit on this format. So a lot of the early research I did kind of got lost on the wayside. But I did. In college, I studied anthropology, which was actually a great start for something like this in terms of what to look for in cultures, because it's it's hard to disengage yourself from your own culture and look at it as something foreign. It's taking off your culture glasses, so to speak, to get away from your own mindsets and be able to see the familiar as foreign. So I love to be able to look up other cultures for inspiration about how do other cultures worldwide do these ordinary things that we don't necessarily think about. Like at one point I was doing research on weddings, and it is fun to learn about all the different cultures, different ways they have weddings. But it's still, you do tend to look at it as being something foreign, whereas people in that culture would look at ours as being foreign. So it sometimes takes some doing to undo that mentality in yourself. As to other types of research, not a ton. I did some about museums and running museums, as that's something that comes up kind of halfway through the book. But not a whole lot of specific things. In upcoming books, I definitely have done a lot more research. Writers always joke that the FBI would be hard-pressed to differentiate our search histories from a serial killer's for some of the things that we would look up. But upcoming books, I'll have a clearer sense, I think, of what I've researched. But this book has been so long in the making for me. A lot of it, initial research kind of got lost in the wayside, so to speak.
Sure. Yeah, that's understandable. I can imagine that most research is there but not there, if that makes sense. It's
Sure,
it informs
absolutely.
your writing, but you can't just put in everything that you learned, or you'd have every book would be 1,000 pages. Are there any kind of autobiographical elements within your book or characters?
Bits and pieces. Like I've said, Rachel in many ways is that would-be confident voice in my head that I have trouble letting out. So it's nice to be able to put her on page. Some other characters, like my character Bach, who's struggling with mental issues of his own, very dissimilar to my own, but that same sort of struggle is there. So there are little bits of autobiographical things peppered in here, not as much as some of the other things that I've worked on, but it always comes up in strange ways. Sometimes as a writer, you don't realize how much of yourself ends up on the page until you go back and just notice it once. Just randomly will notice it at the strangest time. Oh yeah, I see now where I got that.
Yeah, I can imagine that would be the case. What do you think draws you to this particular genre, to writing fantasy?
I've always loved fantasy, and I love many types of fantasy. Although high fantasy is epic fantasy it's a joy to read at times. It's so much harder to write in a very grounded and convincing way. So I like to start more with what I know, which is just start with the world I live in and build off from there. So it's that love of magic. It's that love of that hidden part of reality. It's the love of the things you can't see, you can't touch, but you always wish were there. It's that childhood longing for something bigger than yourself. And it's when you feel that connection, when you feel that love of the mystical, the love of the beyond, that it's a joy really to just sit down and let it come out of you, because it's no fun to keep that all bottled up. You want to let it out. You want to share it. You want other people to see the magic.
Mm-hmm. I always think of writers who do high fantasy. I always think of that process. I mean, in terms of world building, holy cow! How do you even know when to stop? Because you're creating an entirely different world. So I feel like
something like J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote whole language. You think, good Lord, I don't have the education to write something like that.
Right? Yeah, entire languages. Yeah, I don't. That's just amazing. Down to the alphabet.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I'm just going to create a new alphabet today. Why not? I wonder.
Better you than
I
me.
wonder.
That's awesome. Go for it.
Right. I wonder if he knew at the time that, a century later, people would be speaking in Elvish. Like.
Oh goodness. How could you know? Yeah, but wow.
Right.
What a legacy.
Well, that's too much pressure. I don't want. I don't want to write a language that people are going to be speaking 100 years from now. I can't do it.
Not at all.
So, what are you working on now in terms of the series?
In terms of series, I'm working on the third book. I've already the second one comes out fall of next year. So it's in the editing process right now. The third one, this is one another one I've had trouble writing. I'm right now going back and kind of reworking big sections of it. But it's in the works, and I'd say it's probably 2/3 of the way done. So it's moving along.
Speaking of moving along, it is already time for our final break of the podcast. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author Alison Levy.
Do you have a particular writing process? Do you set a schedule for writing? Do you write when you have the opportunity? How does that tend to work for you?
Oh, I would love to set a schedule I could keep to, but man, that's not the world we live in, is it? I do try to set aside several days a week to just do nothing but writing. Things do come up, but I do try to sit down to do it. It's hard to, writing is an outlet for me for my anxiety, but there are days where it just doesn't work. And the days when it does work, and those days when the anxiety is not as big an issue, I get so much done. Fabulous. But then there are those days where I think of my anxiety as a tiger in some ways, that there's a tiger in the room, and there are some days when the tiger is just breathing down my neck and it's just not working. I have worked out some ways to help. I often, while I'm writing, I will have an old movie on in the background, something I've seen 50 times, not really interested in, but the noise kind of keeps that anxious side of my brain engaged so I don't have to deal with it. But yeah, I joined a critique group a couple of years ago, actually. Oh, goodness, it's been that long. But that actually helps keep me motivated, because we have twice a month we meet up to share what we've worked on. So it kind of keeps me honest to say, okay, I have to take something in. I got to work on something, even if it's not my best work. I got to get something done. So it's nice to have that motivator to help.
Mm-hmm. I can imagine that something like anxiety would be a bit of a double-edged sword, because, as you said, it is an outlet for your anxiety, but from my own experience, that anxiety can also tend to be a little crippling sometimes. And so, the days that it helps, awesome. The days when it doesn't help, very much less than awesome.
You work around it as well as you can, and you learn those little tricks for yourself as to how to get through it. But some days it's just
Yeah.
not happening, and those are the days I gotta find something else to do.
Yep. Yep. Well, and it's good to know that about yourself and not just try
Yes.
to, in that you have ways around it. So that's wonderful.
Yeah.
You mentioned that you've been writing since you were 12. So, and there was law school and marriage and family and all those fun things. What made you finally decide to say, you know what, I'm going to do this and make a go of it?
Really, my husband just encouraged me every which way, because I've published through Spark Press, which is a hybrid publisher. So it's not traditional publishing, but I was worried about the cost of it and the cost of promoting the book and doing all these things, and with the anxiety, worried about will I be able to do it, and he's just been on board and been my cheerleader the entire way, saying, I know you can do this, you've got it in you, you're a good writer, you can do it. So it was finally just saying, okay, I've written these things. It's either I just sit on it forever and it's just a hobby, or I actually make a go of it, and hey, maybe it'll work, maybe it won't, but at least I tried. And that's finally where it got to. And with his support, I finally just said, okay, I'm gonna take that jump and see how it goes.
All right. Well, it's wonderful to have the support and the cheerleader. Yeah, that's great. Out of your particular journey, then, would you have advice for aspiring authors?
The best thing to do is keep doing what you're doing, keep writing, because even if it never sees the light of day, it's still yours. And that in and of itself makes it worth doing. It can be its own reward. And if you're willing to put in the legwork, willing to take the jump to get to publishing, it can be very rewarding. It can be very hard. It can be very nerve-wracking. But the best thing you can do is try. Because really, that's all any of us can do is just try.
This is true. Yeah, absolutely. In terms of your personal reading, when you take the time to read for yourself, you mentioned Neil Gaiman. Who else would you say would be your go-to authors or genres?
My go-to genre really is modern fairy tales, modern retelling of myths. I recently read The Witch's Heart. Let's see, Genevieve Gorshnik. I'm saying that wrong, but which is a book about the Norse myth of Angrboda, who's the mother of Loki's monster children, which is such a fascinating idea to write about her, and also the book very well done about it. The sense of time is very boggled in that, but it makes sense from her point of view, and that she is not human and she's experiencing time differently than us. But I really loved the telling of her with her very bizarre offspring and her very unusual relationships with Loki and others around her. So that was a real treat to read. Definitely recommend that. Other books I've read, I love a lot of different Greek myth books that have come out. I never seem to get tired of them, never run out of them to read. Olympus, Texas by Stacey Swan, I read recently, which is sort of taking the characters from Greek myth and setting them in modern Texas, which works shockingly well. Like, how on earth did nobody see that kind of connection? Greek myths are just Alison in the old days. It's great.
In terms of internet presence, do you have a website, and where can people interact with you on social media?
I do have a website. It's damoncollecting.com. Being helped by a friend of mine, also a published author named Eileen McFalls, who's helping me out with that. Social media, your best bet to get me is on Instagram. I'm A. Levy Author. I do have a Twitter account, also a Levy author. I wouldn't recommend it. I'm very rarely on Twitter. You can also find me on Facebook, though, for Alison Levy author.
Okay. Thank you for that. We have talked about the book. We've talked about writing. Is there anything, though, that we haven't covered that you would like to mention at this point about the book or the series or writing in general? Anything that we haven't covered?
I tried to use a little bit with talking about my writing and talking about my experience in terms of mental health and anxiety, depression. I just always want to remind people it's fine to have anxiety. It's fine to have depression, and it's okay to deal with it any number of ways, so long as you are addressing it. Please do what you can to get yourself as healthy as you can be.
Absolutely, and that is even more timely because this interview will come out the first week of June, but we are having this conversation May 30th, which is almost the last day of the month, and it has been Mental Health Awareness Month.
Yeah.
So, yeah, very, very important and timely. So thank you for that. And thank you for taking the time to talk to me about Rachel and Gatekeeper and just writing in general. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been so much fun.
Thank you once again to Alison for joining me. And also, we talked a little bit about anxiety and May being Mental Health Awareness Month. And I'm just appreciative of people who are open and upfront about things like anxiety, depression, etc. It's becoming more acceptable to talk about those things, but I think a lot of people are still afraid to talk about them. And so I'm appreciative of Alison's bravery and upfrontedness. Is that a word? You know what I mean, in terms of just, mentioning that and mentioning how it affects her writing or how her writing affects her anxiety. As someone who has struggled with anxiety and depression myself, I am appreciative of others who can talk about their own issues with that and how they deal with it, how they live with it, etc. So thank you to Alison for that. In fact, when Alison and I were talking and she, was giving social media handles, I went to her Instagram page. I had to send her an email afterwards because I was like, wow, I just looked through your Instagram pictures. I think I said I was stalking her Instagram. And she crochets and obviously she writes and reads, and she has dogs and a bearded dragon. I think she said it was her son's, but there was a picture of a bearded dragon. And I was like, hey, I have bearded dragons. I have dogs. I was just very, very excited. There were all these things on our Instagram page. I was like, wow, we are sort of twins. Not really twins, maybe, I don't know, cousins or something. But there's a lot of things on her Instagram page that I greatly appreciated. So that was fun. At any rate, thank you again to Alison. And thank you to you, my listeners. As always, if you're a fan of this podcast, please follow on social media. Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, GSMC Book Review. You can also leave a review, whether that's written or a starred review on whatever platform you listen to the podcast on. That is super helpful and really does help us get this podcast out to more people who may be interested in books and authors and all of that good, fun stuff. I hope that you will join me next time. We are sticking with the fantasy genre. This time it is historical fantasy, and the book is called The Last of the Gifted. That's the series, and the book is Spirit Sight. The author is Marie Powell, so I hope that you will join me for that. We'll be discussing book 1 and a little bit about book 2 as well, so join me for that. In the meantime, have a wonderful, wonderful week. May that week involve plenty of time to get yourself lost in a good book. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.glsm.com. GSMCpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.